His father was dead, the funeral was cold and quiet, the sky a dull grey. As the rain fell in thin sheets, the air smelled of damp earth and wilting flowers. People whispered in hushed voices, some offering condolences, others murmuring theories about his sudden passing. But he barely listened, his focus locked on his alien stepmother, who stood apart from the crowd, her luminous eyes fixed on the sky, her bioluminescent skin shifting through dull colors that did not match the sorrow around them. She had barely spoken since the news of his father's death, barely moved except when necessary. She refused to eat unless he reminded her, and even then she only took a few bites before staring off into nothingness, as if lost in a world he could not see. Her presence was unsettling, more so than before, because she was not just grieving, she was different. His father had married her years ago, despite the controversy, despite the whispers about humans and aliens mixing, despite the warnings that their species were too different. She had always been quiet, reserved, even strange. But his father had loved her, had trusted her, had believed she was more than just her alien origins. And yet now, standing here at the funeral, it felt as if she was something else entirely. As the last handfuls of soil were thrown over the grave, she turned and walked away without a word, her movements slow, deliberate, her gaze never once meeting his stomach twisted, unease creeping up his spine. Something was wrong. The house felt different without his father. It was too still, too hollow. The silence stretched long into the night, and yet he could not sleep because she was awake, wandering through the halls, her footsteps impossibly light. But always, they're always moving, always stopping outside his father's study, a room that had been locked since his passing. One night curiosity overcame him, and he crept downstairs, watching from the shadows. She stood in front of the door, her hand pressed against the wood, her fingers trembling slightly, her breath slow, deep. But there was something else, something he could not explain, a faint hum in the air like a vibration just beneath the surface of reality. Her lips moved, forming words, but no sound came out. He strained to hear, but the silence remained heavy, suffocating. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned her glowing gaze, piercing through the darkness. He froze, heart hammering against his ribs. She stared at him, unblinking, unreacting, for what felt like an eternity, and then she smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that did not reach her eyes before she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. He let out a breath. He did not realize he had been holding his hands, was shaking, his mind racing. Something was wrong with her. This was not just grief. This was something else, something he did not understand. The next morning she was gone, at least for a while. He found himself searching for any sign of where she had been, any clue to her strange behavior. But the house held its secrets well until he found the security logs. Opening the files, he scrolled through the footage, late at night timestamps, confirming what he already knew. She never slept, she never even went to her room. Instead, she moved through the house, pacing, stopping at the study, standing by the windows, staring at the sky, as if waiting for something. But then came the part that made his blood run cold. At exactly 3 a.m. every night, she stood in the center of the living room and simply stopped, not moving, not breathing, standing perfectly still for hours. And then at 3:33 a.m. sharp, she lifted her head and whispered something that made the lights flicker and the camera glitch, static washing over the screen before cutting out completely. His breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening on the desk. This was not normal. This was not just grief. He didn't know what it was, but he was going to find out. That night he set up more cameras, adjusting the angles, making sure every corner of the house was covered. He double-checked the timestamps in the logs, making note of the exact time the disturbances occurred. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. His stepmother was doing something unnatural, something that made the air feel heavier, that made the walls seem closer, that made the silence in the house feel like it was alive. He stayed awake, watching the live feed on his laptop. The clock ticked slowly, the night stretched long, and cold shadows pooling in the corners of the room. He kept the lights off, listening to the faint hum of the electronics, the occasional creak of the house settling. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the cameras flickered just like before, and there she was standing in the center of the living room, her back straight, her hands loose at her sides, her glowing skin pulsing in slow, uneven waves. His breath caught in his throat as he watched her motionless, unblinking. The way she held herself was unnatural, too still like she was frozen in time. But then at 3:33 a.m., she moved her head, tilting upward, her mouth opening slightly, and then the whispering began. His speakers buzzed, the sound warped, layered like more than one voice was speaking, but he couldn't make out the words. The sound wasn't normal. It wasn't even a language he recognized. It was something else, something deep, something that made his bones vibrate, something that made his chest tighten. The lights in the house flickered, dimming for a moment, before stabilizing the camera feed, blurred static crackling over the screen. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. She turned slowly, unnaturally, her glowing eyes locking onto the camera, as if she knew he was watching. His heart pounded against his ribs, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. But he couldn't look away. She held that gaze for an impossibly long moment. Then, without a word, she walked out of the frame, disappearing into the darkness. He exhaled shakily, his mind scrambling for an explanation. He rewound the footage, playing it back again, and again the whispering, the lights, the way she stared directly into the camera. Something about it felt intentional. Closing his laptop, he stood, moving cautiously through the house. The air felt thick, heavy, with something he couldn't name. He stepped into the living room, staring at the spot where she had been standing earlier. The floorboards looked the same, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Then he heard its soft, distant whispering coming from down the hall, his father's study. His pulse quickened, his muscles tensed, but he forced himself to move, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The study door was still locked, just as it had been since his father's death, but the whispering was coming from inside. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to listen. The words were still warped, layered, shifting in tone and rhythm, but beneath it, all he heard something familiar, his father's voice. His stomach lurched, a cold chill spreading through his veins. He grabbed the doorknob, twisting it, but it didn't budge. Locked like always, he stepped back, breath unsteady, his mind spinning. His father was dead. He had seen the body, he had buried him. So how was his voice coming from inside that room? A shuffling noise from behind made him freeze. He turned slowly, and there she was standing in the hallway, her glowing eyes unreadable, her face blank, emotionless. She didn't speak, didn't move, she just stared at him. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The whispering from the study grew louder, pressing against his ears, crawling under his skin. He clenched his fists, taking a slow breath, steadying himself. "What are you doing in there?" he finally managed to say, his voice low, unsteady. She blinked once slowly, and her head tilted ever so slightly, as if considering his words. When she spoke, her voice was wrong. It wasn't layered like before, but it was too soft, too careful, as if she was choosing each word with deliberate precision. "I'm waiting," she said. His throat tightened, waiting for what? She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a slow, eerie smile that did not belong to her, and then she turned, walking away, disappearing into the dark, leaving him standing alone, with nothing but the whispers behind the locked door. His hands trembled as he reached for the lock, but he hesitated. The whispers behind the door had faded, but the silence they left behind was worse. It was heavy, pressing against him, making it harder to breathe. His father's voice had been in there, distorted, layered, hidden beneath something else, something that did not belong. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He turned away, moving back through the darkened hallway. His stepmother was gone, disappeared into whatever shadows she seemed to drift between. He needed answers, and he knew where to look. His father's office had been locked since his death, but his father was a scientist, meticulous about security, and he knew there had to be a way in. He went to his own room, digging through the drawers in search of the small metal key his father had given him years ago. For emergencies, he had almost forgotten about it until now. But when he finally found it, the cold weight of it in his palm sent a surge of unease through him. Returning to the study, he hesitated for only a moment before sliding the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked softly. The door creaked open, revealing a space untouched since his father's passing. The air was stale, the desk cluttered with scattered notes, half-finished projects, calculations that meant nothing to him at first glance. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His fingers traced over the papers. His father's handwriting was sharp, precise, but something about the words felt rushed, desperate. Flipping through the pages, he found scattered phrases that sent ice through his veins. Containment protocol failing, host unaware, external influence increasing. She cannot know what she carries. He swallowed, hard his mind, racing, host unaware, host. His stepmother, his breath caught in his throat. His father had been researching something classified, something dangerous, and it had something to do with her. But what did she carry? What was she unaware of? He kept digging, his hands shaking as he opened the locked drawer in the desk. Inside was a small tablet, still powered on a single document open, labeled The Inheritance. His heart pounded as he clicked it open. The first few lines were clinical, detached. But as he scrolled further, the words became frantic, urgent. The experiment was never meant to reach this stage. She was supposed to be a vessel, nothing more, but something changed. The connection deepened beyond expected parameters. If it wakes before the failsafe is activated, the consequences will be irreversible. I have to stop it. I have to stop it before she realizes what she is, before she understands what's inside her. His stomach twisted. He glanced back toward the door, suddenly afraid of what might be on the other side. His stepmother was acting strange, because something inside her was waking up, something his father had tried to stop, something he had failed to contain. A sharp knock at the door made him jump. He spun around, heart hammering. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. He stepped back, gripping the tablet, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Are you in there?" Her voice soft, muffled through the wood. But it was wrong. Something about it sent his instincts screaming. She didn't sound concerned. She sounded curious, like she already knew what he had found. He didn't answer. He turned off the tablet, shoving it into his pocket, his mind racing. He needed to get out of there, needed to figure out what to do. But before he could move, the doorknob turned slowly. He backed away, gripping the edge of the desk. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her glowing eyes fixed on him, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be in here," she said. Her voice was still soft, but there was something else beneath it, something layered, something shifting, like an echo of something larger than her. His fingers tightened around the desk. "What is inside you?" he asked, forcing the words out. She tilted her head, her expression unchanging. Then she took a slow step forward. The air around her seemed to shimmer, distort, as if reality itself bent around her. "I don't know," she whispered, "but it wants to wake up." He felt the room tighten around him, like the air itself was pressing in. His stepmother stood in the doorway, her glowing eyes locked onto his, her skin pulsing in slow waves of light. Her presence was wrong, not just strange, but fundamentally wrong, like something deep inside her was shifting, stretching, reaching for something unseen. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "What do you mean it wants to wake up?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. She blinked slowly, then took another step into the room. The walls behind her seemed to darken, the shadows stretching out unnaturally. Her movements were deliberate, careful, like she was trying not to startle him, or maybe like she was trying to keep something inside herself from breaking free. "I don't know," she said again. But the way she said it made him think she wasn't telling the full truth. She paused, tilting her head, as if listening to something he could not hear. "My memories are incomplete, fragmented. Ever since he died, it has been changing. Something inside me is shifting. It wants something. But I do not know what." He thought about the files, the notes, his father's frantic handwriting, the words host, unaware, host. If she was the host, then that meant something else was inside her, something that had been dormant, but was now waking up. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. His father had been a xenobiologist, had studied alien biology, had worked on classified projects. What if his stepmother had been more than just his wife? What if she had been part of an experiment, one she hadn't even known about? He needed answers, and fast, but he couldn't push her too hard, not when he had no idea what he was dealing with. Then a thought struck him. "You keep going to the study at night, standing by the door, whispering, do you remember what you say?" Her glowing eyes flickered. She hesitated for just a moment, but it was enough. "No," she said finally, "but when I wake up I feel like something is missing, something important, something I need to find." The way she said it sent a chill through him. She wasn't just acting strange, she was being drawn to something, compelled by something, and she didn't even know why. He needed to see those security recordings again, needed to hear those whispers, more clearly needed to find a way to understand what was happening before it was too late. "Stay here," he said, moving past her before she could react. Her head turned, following him, but she did not try to stop him. Instead, she simply watched as he walked away. He made his way to his room, locking the door behind him. He pulled up the security footage from the past few nights, rewinding to the exact moment she stood in the living room motionless, staring at nothing. The whispering started again, the strange layered voices echoing through his speakers. He turned up the volume, straining to make out the words, but they were distorted, shifting, too unnatural to be a known language. But something about them tugged at his mind, like a half-remembered dream, like something buried deep inside him was trying to recognize what he was hearing. He played it again, slower this time, and then he caught it, a single word buried beneath the layers of sound, a word spoken in his father's voice. "Run." His breath hitched, his entire body going cold. His father had been trying to warn him. Even after death, his father had known what was happening, had left behind a message hidden inside the whispers. The realization hit him hard. His stepmother was not just changing, she was becoming something else, something his father had tried to contain. And now that he was gone, nothing was stopping it from breaking free. A soft knock on his door made his blood freeze. He turned slowly, his breath shallow. "Are you all right?" Her voice gentle, muffled through the wood. But he didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because for the first time he realized she hadn't knocked. The knock had come from inside his room. His body locked in place, his breath caught in his throat. The knock had come from inside the room, but he was alone. The walls were bare, the shadows still, but the air was wrong, heavy, charged, like something unseen was pressing against reality itself. His stepmother knocked again from outside the door, her voice soft, concerned. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer. His fingers hovered over the laptop trackpad, replaying the recording again, his father's voice buried in the whispers. "Run." The knock had come at the exact moment. The word was spoken as if something inside the recording had reached through the screen into his reality. His pulse pounded. He turned slowly, scanning the room, his bed, his desk, his closet, all exactly where they should be. Nothing was out of place, but something was here, something he couldn't see. He reached for the desk lamp, flipping the switch, but the bulb flickered, dimmed, then died, plunging the room into darkness. His laptop screen cast weak blue light over his hands as the whispering from the speakers grew louder, stretching, twisting, until the sound was inside his head. His stepmother knocked again, this time more firmly. "Open the door, please, I need to talk to you." He hesitated, then stood, moving carefully toward the door, but as his fingers brushed the doorknob, a cold breath of air swept through the room, and behind him something moved. He spun around, heart hammering, but nothing was there, only the darkness, only the feeling that he was not alone. His stepmother knocked again, but now her voice was different, distorted, layered, like the whispering from the recordings. "Open the door," she repeated, but it was not just her speaking anymore. It was something else speaking through her, speaking with her. He stumbled back, reaching for the laptop, shutting it. The whispering stopped, but the feeling remained thick, pressing against his skin. Then the doorknob turned slowly from the outside. His stepmother was opening the door, but he had locked it. He was sure he had locked it. The door creaked open inch by inch, and she stood there, glowing eyes, unreadable skin pulsing, like slow waves of light. Her face was calm, too calm, but there was something behind her, something unseen, that he could feel pressing forward, like an invisible presence waiting, watching. "You found something, didn't you?" she said softly. His mouth was dry. He forced himself to swallow. "What is inside you?" he asked again. Her head tilted just slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration, like she was weighing the question carefully before responding. "I don't know," she said again, but this time she stepped forward into his room, crossing the threshold with slow, deliberate steps, her gaze never leaving his. "But I think you do." He backed up until he hit the desk, his fingers tightening against the wood. "I saw the research," he said, his voice low, unsteady. "My father was studying something about you, something about a containment experiment." Her expression didn't change, but something about her presence did. The air around her wavered like heat, rising from pavement, her bioluminescent skin flickering in patterns too fast for him to track. He wanted to believe she was still his stepmother, but every instinct in him screamed that she wasn't, that whatever was standing in front of him was only wearing her shape. He took a slow breath, then asked the question he was afraid to hear the answer to. Was he trying to keep you from waking up? Her lips parted just slightly, almost as if she was about to speak, but then she stopped. She looked down at her own hands, flexing her fingers, staring as if seeing them for the first time. I think he was trying to keep you from knowing I could wake up, she murmured. His skin went cold. Because now I do. The walls around them shuddered. The light from his laptop flickered, distorted for just a second, and then a second knock came from inside the room again. But this time he saw where it came from, his closet door. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. His muscles locked, his gaze fixed on the closet door. The knock had been soft, deliberate, the same way his stepmother had knocked just moments ago. But she was standing right in front of him, which meant something else, something unseen, had made that sound. His stepmother's glowing eyes flicked toward the closet, her expression unreadable. Her skin pulsed again, waves of light, moving too fast, too erratic, like something inside her was responding to whatever was behind that door. She took a step forward, tilting her head, as if listening. The air thickened, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He wanted to move, wanted to run, but he was frozen, trapped between the thing in the closet and the thing wearing his stepmother's face. "Open it," she said softly. His heart pounded. "What's in there?" He forced out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and the closet door clicked, the latch sliding free by itself. The wood creaked as the door swung open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness, an empty void that felt impossibly deep, like a space that shouldn't exist inside a simple closet. Then the whispering started again, not from his laptop this time, not from his stepmother, but from the darkness itself. It was the same layered sound, the same warped voices, shifting, twisting, pressing into his mind, and somewhere beneath it all, buried deep in the chaos, was his father's voice. "Run!" His pulse slammed against his ribs, his instincts screamed at him to move, to get out, to listen to the warning. But his stepmother was still watching, still waiting. She took another step forward, her glowing gaze locked onto the darkness in the closet, like she recognized it, like she was connected to it. "This is what he was afraid of," she murmured. His fingers curled into fists. "What is it?" he demanded. She didn't look at him, she didn't blink, she just whispered, "I don't know, but it's been waiting." The darkness inside the closet rippled like something just beyond sight, was shifting, moving, trying to take shape. The whispering grew louder, rising into something close to words, but not quite. Then the shadows surged forward. He barely had time to react as the air cracked with unseen force. Something cold rushed past him, wrapping around his stepmother, her body jerked as if something had latched onto her, her glowing skin flaring too bright, too unstable, her expression twisted between recognition and something else, something deeper, something not human. She didn't scream, she didn't resist, she only whispered something under her breath, words he couldn't hear before the darkness pulled her inside. The closet door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire room. Silence. His breath came in ragged gasps, his entire body trembling. The air was still heavy, but the presence was gone. His stepmother was gone. The whispering had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house felt completely empty. His mind raced through the possibilities. What had just happened? What had his father been trying to contain? What had his stepmother become? Was she even still her, or had she been something else all along? He stumbled back, ripping the edge of the desk. His father's notes flashed through his mind. Containment protocol failing, external influence increasing. She cannot know what she carries. She hadn't known. But now she did, and now she was gone. He had to get out of here, had to leave, had to find someone who could help, who could explain what was happening. But just as he turned toward the door, a new sound filled the room. A soft knock. Not from the closet, not from the door, but from behind him. His blood ran cold. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned. His laptop screen flickered, static dancing across the display, the blue glow casting eerie shadows against the walls. Then the image cleared, and his stepmother's face appeared, staring directly at him. But it wasn't a recording. She was looking at him in real time. She was somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't see, but she could see him. Her lips parted, her voice came through the speakers, soft, distant, layered. You should not have opened the door. His breath hitched his skin, crawling with cold dread. His stepmother's glowing eyes stared through the screen, unblinking, unreadable. The air around him felt thick, pressing down, as if the walls themselves were leaning in on him. His fingers hovered over the laptop trackpad. His mind screamed at him to shut it, to run, to do anything. But just as he moved, her lips parted again, and her voice lay a distant yet sharp cut through the silence. "You let it out." His stomach twisted. He wanted to deny it, wanted to believe this was all in his head. But the closet door, the shadows, the way she had been pulled inside, it had all been real. "Where are you?" he forced out, his voice barely above a whisper. The screen flickered her face, shifting slightly as if the connection was unstable. She glanced to the side, as if listening to something, then back to him. "I don't know." Her voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "It's different here outside, but not outside. Real, but not real." His pulse pounded. His father's notes raced through his mind, external influence increasing. She cannot know what she carries. Had the thing inside her been a part of her all along, or had it been something else, something that had been waiting, something that had only needed him to open the door? His fingers curled into fists. "What is it? What did I let out?" Her expression remained unreadable for a long moment. Then slowly she blinked when she spoke. Her voice was no longer layered, no longer distorted. She sounded almost normal, but that only made it worse. "It's waking up." His laptop screen glitched for a second, the pixels distorting into strange, unreadable symbols. Then a sound came through the speakers, low, distant at first, then growing louder. It wasn't whispering this time. It was breathing, slow, deep, like something massive was just beyond the screen, like something had just noticed him. His heart slammed against his ribs. His instincts screamed to shut the laptop, but his hands wouldn't move. She leaned in closer, her glowing eyes locking onto her skin, still pulsing, but slower now, steadier. "It's looking for you," she whispered. His breath came fast and uneven. The air around him felt wrong, the room darker than it had been before. He turned his head, slightly scanning his surroundings. Nothing had changed. The closet was still closed, the walls still standing, but something felt different, something he couldn't place. Then he saw it. The shadows in the corner of the room were moving, shifting, stretching along the floor, along the ceiling. They were reaching for him. His stomach dropped. He shoved the laptop, shut the room, plunged into silence, but the air still felt heavy, charged. He staggered back towards the door, gripping the handle, his knuckles white. He yanked it open, stepped into the hallway, but the house wasn't the same. The walls seemed longer, the ceiling higher, the familiar furniture stretched, distorted, as if reality itself had bent out of shape. He turned left toward the front door. Every step felt slower, heavier, like he was wading through something thick, unseen. But then he heard it. A soft knock behind him. His breath caught his body, locked in place. Slowly, he turned his head, expecting the closet, expecting the laptop. But the knock hadn't come from either. It had come from the front door. His pulse rolled in his ears. He swallowed hard, forcing himself forward, his steps unsteady. His shaking fingers reached for the knob. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to stop, but he had to know, he had to see. He turned the handle, pulled the door open. Outside there was no street, no sky, no world. Only darkness stretching endlessly. And in that darkness, standing just beyond the threshold, was his stepmother, glowing eyes, pulsing skin, shifting, the same unreadable expression on her face. But this time she wasn't alone. His body refused to move, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. His stepmother stood at the threshold, glowing eyes locked onto him, but it was the thing beside her that made his skin crawl. It had no shape, not exactly, shadows twisted around it, folding into themselves, writhing like something unfinished, something that had never needed a form before this moment, and now it was trying to make one. The air between them pulsed thick, heavy, charged with something that made his head throb, his vision blur. Reality itself seemed unstable around the thing, as if the world struggled to contain it. His stepmother tilted her head, her expression unreadable, but not empty. Something flickered beneath the surface, something almost like understanding, like she was caught between two things, herself and whatever had been inside her all along. "You let it out," she whispered again, but this time there was no accusation, no anger, just a strange, distant sadness. His throat was dry. He forced the words out. "What is it?" The thing beside her pulsed, shifted the shadows around it, stretching, reaching, but never quite touching the ground. "It was waiting," she said softly, "waiting for you, for him, for all of this." His father's notes flashed through his mind: containment protocol, failing host, unaware, external influence increasing. She cannot know what she carries. His father had been trying to stop something from waking, something that had been inside her all along. But now she knew, now she understood, and now it was free. He stepped back, the world behind him, distorted, stretched, his home, no longer his home, just an echo of something familiar, bending around the presence, standing at the door. "What does it want?" His voice barely a whisper. His stepmother blinked, her glow flickered, dimmed, before flaring brighter than before, to become, she said simply. The shadows at her feet twisted, grew larger, spread across the doorway, reaching past the threshold into the house itself. The air grew heavier, his skin tingled, every nerve screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. Where would he go? There was no outside, no street, no sky, just the endless void where his stepmother stood. She took a step forward, the thing beside her moved with her, but not like a creature, walking more like something, shifting between moments, 1 second, still the next, closer, without ever seeming to move. "You should not have opened the door," she said again, and this time she almost sounded like herself. His breath caught, he clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. What happens now? Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "Now it chooses," she said. Before he could react, the shadows surged forward, faster than thought, faster than fear. They wrapped around him, pulled at his arms, his legs, his chest. The air turned cold, his vision blurred. He felt himself being yanked forward, toward the door, toward the darkness, beyond it, toward the thing that had been waiting all along. He fought, twisted, struggled, but it was like fighting the ocean, the pull too strong, the force too vast. His stepmother watched, unmoving, her glow flickering like a signal, like a warning, like something still trapped inside her was trying to break free. Then, just as his body crossed the threshold, as the cold void swallowed the air around him, she moved her hand, barely a flicker. But it changed everything. The shadows hesitated for the first time. They recoiled, just slightly, as if confused, as if uncertain, and in that single instant, he yanked himself back, stumbled away from the door, fell hard against the warped wooden floor of the house, gasping for breath. The shadows twisted, convulsed. The thing beside his stepmother shrieked, not a sound, but a vibration, something that shook the walls, that pressed into his bones. His stepmother turned slowly, looking at the thing, at the shifting shadows, at the endless void stretching beyond them. And then she stepped back into it. Her form shimmered, flickered, twisted into the dark, her glowing eyes, the last thing to disappear, before the door slammed shut, cutting off the void, cutting off the whispers, cutting off everything. The air was still, the house was silent. Reality held itself together once more. He lay there, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps, staring at the closed door, his mind screaming, his body trembling. She was gone. But the words she had left behind echoed in his skull. "Now it chooses." Silence swallowed the house. The walls no longer stretched, the shadows no longer moved. But the air was still wrong, heavy, charged, like something unseen was lingering just beyond his senses, waiting, watching. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his body still trembling from the pull of the void, from the sight of his stepmother stepping back into the darkness, from the presence of a thing that had no shape, yet had still somehow been there. Slowly he pushed himself up, his hands shaking, his gaze locked on the front door. It looked normal now, plain wooden, closed, as if nothing had ever happened, as if she had never been standing there, as if the void had never reached for him. But he knew better. His mind raced with everything that had happened, his father's notes, the warnings, the containment, his stepmother changing, the whispers, the closet, the laptop, the knocking, the moment he had opened the door and let something out, something that had been waiting, something that had been watching, something that now had a choice. His stomach twisted. His father had known, his father had been trying to stop this, to stop it from waking, to stop it from knowing, and he had failed, and now his stepmother was gone. But not gone completely. He could still feel her presence, somehow faint, distant, like a thought at the edge of his mind, like a dream half remembered, but not forgotten. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand, his legs unsteady, his hands still curled into fists. He had to know, he had to be sure. Slowly, he stepped toward the front door, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. He reached for the knob, hesitated, his fingers hovering over the cool metal. He turned it just slightly, just enough to test it locked. His breath left him in a slow exhale, relief mixed with dread, because the door had never been locked before, not when she had been standing there, not when the void had been waiting, but now it was locked, and that meant something had changed. He stepped back, his mind racing. What now? What happened next? Was it over? Was it waiting? Was it still here? Then he heard it. A single soft knock. Not from the front door, not from the closet, not from the laptop. This time it came from the window. His breath hitched, his gaze snapped to the glass. The curtains were drawn, but the knock had been clear, deliberate, patient. He didn't move, he didn't breathe, he just stared, waiting, listening. Another knock, slow, measured, calm. His pulse pounded, he swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a slow step forward. Then another, the floor creaked beneath him, but the knock did not come again. Carefully he reached out, grasping the edge of the curtain, his fingers tightening, his breath shallow. He pulled it back. His stepmother stood outside, her glowing eyes steady, her skin dimmer than before, no longer pulsing with erratic waves of light, no longer shifting between something human and something else. But it was her. His throat tightened, his mind screamed that this wasn't possible, that she had stepped into the void, that she had been taken, that she had been consumed. But here she was standing outside, watching, waiting, her lips parted, but he couldn't hear her, her mouth moved, but no sound came through the glass. His pulse rolled in his ears, he pressed his hand against the window. She mirrored him, placing her palm against the glass, her skin, no longer warm, no longer alive, but not gone, not entirely. A whisper slit through the barrier between them, faint, distant, layered. It has chosen. His breath hitched his body, locking in place, his thoughts racing. What do you mean? He mouthed the words, his voice refusing to come out. Her expression remained unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes, something familiar, something ancient, something not her, but still inside her. It will wait, she whispered. His blood ran cold. Wait for what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, barely more than a thought. Her fingers pressed against the glass, her glow fading, dimming, becoming something less, something further away. For the next door, she whispered. Then she was gone. Not stepped away, not faded, not disappeared, just gone, as if she had never been there, as if the space outside the window had swallowed her without a sound. The night was still, the house was silent, the air was empty. But he knew the truth. Somewhere out there, beyond what he could see, beyond what he could understand, it was waiting.